Hey guys, MC Stu here, and today we're going to take a look at the Aux Phasers that come on the Vesta variants, whether or not they're viable, and with some of the changes that have happened, are they something that we should be using? All right, so with the new legendary Vesta ship that has come out, there's also been some updates to the Aux Phasers. Let's talk about what the Aux Phasers are to start with. So all the variants of the Vesta have in the past and currently come with a set of dual heavy cannons. And what makes these unique is that they draw power from your auxiliary power instead of your weapons power. Standard weapons are going to pull from your weapons power, right? So these are one of the only weapons in the game that are going to pull from somewhere else. There are some experimental weapons and things that'll pull from your engine power or at least scale off them. But that's what makes these particular weapons unique. Now, what has changed is not in the weapons, but what you can equip it to. So in the past, these weapons could only be equipped to the Vesta and all of its variants. They have now changed that to basically cover pretty much all of your science ships that can equip dual heavy cannons. So the spearheads, your destroyers, those kinds of things. So there's a larger variety of ships now that these weapons can be used on. And so the question becomes, are these worth using as opposed to, say, standard, weapons that draw from your weapons power? So let's talk a little bit about just your power and how that works, okay? So all of the different abilities that your ship have are going to pull from one of these four places. So standard weapons, as you fire them, they are going to pull power from this slot here, your weapons power slot. Now, in this particular build, my weapons power is turned all the way down. I do have some bonus power coming from different places, but let's say that this was a different build and we had this maxed out. You can push this to up to about 130, so you can go about a 30 over, depending on how you build it. And as you fire a weapon, it's going to draw power from it. Now, as you draw power from this, you are going to do less damage. So with this turned all the way down, it's still at about halfway. If I were firing weapons that were standard weapons with this, with its current configuration, I would only get half the damage out of it. Now, it scales a little bit different than that. The math gets a little bit weird, but you're going to do a lot less damage. Now, let's say that you started firing a whole bunch of dual heavy cannons that were not Aux with it set like this. If this power drops too low, your weapons will not fire. And that's the same thing with, say, auxiliary and science abilities. So if you were using, say, Aux to Bat, bridge officer ability, and you clicked that, that would drain your auxiliary power and put it into the other three, you would find that your gravity well and some of those things would be grayed out for a time until this power came back up. And so the amount of damage and the amount of control, things like that, off of your science abilities are going to scale with how much auxiliary power you have. So if we're looking at a energy weapon / science build, generally what's going to happen is you're going to have to split the difference here, and you're going to need to favor one or the other. So generally what you'll see in some instances, if it is something that's leaning more towards the energy side of it, the weapons side, you're going to have your weapons maxed out, and then you're going to have the next largest being your auxiliary power. So it would look something, closer to, let's just rescale it here, something closer to something like that, right? Which isn't real bad in the way that is scaled out. And it's a decent option, very good option, especially depending on how you build around getting the bonus damage into these. Sometimes it's not possible depending on the gear you have and things like that. And for me, I don't like personally to go and have to split the difference, right? So if you're going to do a energy weapons build with secondary being, focus on science, then this configuration looks good, right? If you're going to do an EPG, basically pure build, and energy weapons are secondary, then you would want it to look somewhat like this. Now, again, this particular build does have some extra bonus energy weapon in, so we're still getting over 100 on both of these. That's accidental, that I didn't build that in on purpose. That's just kind of the way it worked out. But what ends up happening if we were using regular weapons is that even with this bonus hitting at just over 100 as we start to fire, and all of those weapons start going off in the front, this would dramatically drop down, and your weapons will do a hugely reduced amount of damage. I mean, your power in these settings here make a huge difference on the effectiveness of your weapons and your science abilities. So you have to kind of choose, which one do I want to favor? So with the Aux Phasers, you do not have to choose, right? So with the Aux Phasers, you can crank up your auxiliary all the way to max. I personally like to have my engines also maxed out. Shields aren't as big of a deal to me, so I'm going to run it looking something like this. Now, with that understanding, when we build around standard energy weapons, most of what we're doing is we're wanting to boost this power setting, and we're wanting to reduce the drain to this. So there's a ton of different traits and things that you can do that are going to reduce your weapon's power draw, which is very, very nice when you're building around standard weapons like that. When it comes to auxiliary, and I think Augie had made this point in his video earlier today, there isn't any kind of trait or ability or console that reduces the draw on the auxiliary, which potentially could be problematic. So with that in mind, I went and did some testing. So what I did is I took my Juggy, which is a full cannon scatter volley build. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. It's built around power cost reduction, fire cycle haste, and weapons power, right? So boosting all of those things or reducing the drain that's on it and making it fire as quickly as possible. And so what I did is I took that in and I took a look at, okay, what was the bottom level that we were hitting as all of those things were firing with all the different abilities going off. And then I took this build in, which is based around, this is more of a hybrid. So I built in basically some haste, and built it around, obviously phaser. There's not a ton just directly boosting it except for this bottom row. So, I mean, there is a good amount. Crit chance, crit severity, and science. So this is kind of a hybrid in terms of the build with EPG control and phaser damage. And then I also did a setup on my straight pure EPG science build and basically just swapped out the torpedoes for these Aux weapons and did a comparison to see what was that bottom amount that was drawing from this, or how low did the weapon's power get basically when we were in full combat and pushing that, or the Aux power in the instance of these weapons, to kind of compare what the difference is there, and if it's worth that trade-off of either splitting between them or being able to draw all of it. Because basically what the argument is that there's no Aux reduction. So if you're going to be firing all these weapons and using all of your science abilities, you're going to hammer your auxiliary power. And that's basically going to reduce all of your damage output as opposed to spreading it across maybe two of them, even though they may be somewhat reduced because you're having to split it. And I was actually surprised by the results there. So let's go ahead and start with the Juggy, just so we can get a baseline for just a standard build here. Some things to take into consideration when you're looking at this is I went through these. One is a baseline, one that was built more towards getting as much as I could out of the cannons with it still being some science, and the other one is basically it's a main science, secondary is the cannon scatter volley. So you'll need to look at which kind of angle you're wanting to work towards and whether or not this is worth it, and look at the testing here and see, does it make sense to go with standard phasers and split your power, or does it make sense to go with the auxiliary? So let's go ahead and just take a look at the Juggy for a baseline. Okay, so what I did is I took this into a Khitomer Elite, or I'm sorry, this is an Advanced, I believe. And so it's a private. I'm just by myself, so I'm able to just kind of approach the cube and start firing. And I have my mouse hovering over the bottom here. When I start to play, this will go away here, but we'll get a look at how low that drops. So I'm going to start buffing up here in just a moment, and then we'll start firing. And let's see what happens here. So we're approaching it. We're starting to buff everything up. We're at 125. We're starting to fire. We dropped down there to about 96 was the lowest. And I think there was some stuff still buffing up. So as I went through this and reviewed it, the lowest it was hitting, not counting the 96 because it didn't go that low again, was 102. So 102 is the lowest that was hitting. and it wasn't hitting it a lot. It depends on how that cycle is breaking down as things are refreshing with the traits and some of those things. But we go back over here, we hover over it. Let's get it to come up. There it is. So we're at 125, and we're going to just start shooting. So we can just see kind of a cycle or two with the Juggernaut. So, we sit at 125 quite a bit. That dropped down to about 96, and we're kind of bouncing around in the, I would say, and I'm just kind of, ballparking this here, we're bouncing around in the teens, it looks like to me, 115 or so on average, with a consistent floor of about 102. So not bad. We're staying over 100 basically the whole time. So we're at least getting that base max level out of it. And again, this build is built around power cost reduction, cannon scatter volley, obviously, putting as much power in as we can, and fire cycle haste. So this is, kind of the epitome of being able to maximize that power setting on any kind of a build. And those are the averages that we're getting there. So, we're basically jumping around between the low hundreds and, the high 100 and, teen area. So that's our baseline there with a floor of 102. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. All right. So we're approaching the cube. This here is our hybrid build where we're kind of splitting it. And we're dropping down to 99, but we're also hitting a ceiling of 130 quite a bit. So I've backed out of range. We're going to come back in. We're hitting 99, and we're back up to 130. So this configuration pulling from Aux is, now our weapons power doesn't matter on this because we're not running anything that's drawing from that matters on the particular build. So the ceiling on this is a lot higher because I'm using emergency power to auxiliary. So that's maxing out the maximum amount you can get, which is 130 in any of these power settings. And we're sitting still at about 111 before anything is boosted. Now, the floor on this is 3 lower than the Juggernaut. The Juggernaut. Why do I keep saying that, guys? The Juggernaut at 99, and the floor is higher, though, at 130, but I would say if we're watching these numbers, it's probably averaging a little bit lower, right? So it's averaging probably in the high, 110, 109 range if we were to, actually write all of these down and break it all out. But I was seeing the Juggernaut fluctuating at a slightly higher number in the weapons power settings than what we're seeing on the auxiliary power settings. Now, with that being said, we are also using science abilities and all the other, major damage abilities of the ship itself. Let's take a look at one last build here that is a main science build that's just using these cannons as secondary. Okay, here we are in our Titan. So this is a EPG/control build. I kind of split the difference on those two when I put this together. This is my main science character. And then I went ahead and I just slapped on these weapons. I didn't change anything else on the ship. I was already running auxiliary to, emergency power to auxiliary because of a duty officer I have. It is at the rank 1 instead of 3, but that is still there. And it makes sense, right? I mean, these weapons were put together to be able to synergize with a science build, so you didn't have to split that stuff. So a lot of most of what you're already doing in terms of boosting that is going to help these weapons. But let's just take a look at what our power settings look like on this. So we're going in, we're resting at 126 on this. So this build actually has the highest resting main power level out of the other, all 3 of them. So the Juggy was at 125, and the last build, the Vesta, was at 111 resting. All right, so we're buffing up. We're at 130 now because of that auxiliary boost that we're getting. Okay, and we're firing. Okay, he's moved out of range. It was kind of weird because he was moving away from me on this one, so it kind of screwed it up some. Let's re-engage here and see how low this gets. 99. So we hit the same floor as the Vesta. And I'm seeing it this hover around probably about the same place the Juggy is. Now, there's some other things to take into consideration on this. I'm not using Withering Barrage because I just didn't have it unlocked. Otherwise, I would be. And we would be using Cannon Scatter Volley would be up quite a bit more than what it otherwise would be. So we would have more of a consistent draw on that Aux power. But I would say that this is probably... it's the floor is the same as the Vesta, but the average of it is going to be a little bit higher. And the reason for that is because this particular build is all Science EPG, and most of those kinds of consoles and things are really going to boost your auxiliary on top of all the EPG stuff and control stuff that they do. So because this is built more heavily for Science specifically, you're generally going to have a higher ceiling on your Aux. And that's why we're seeing a higher average there. So, I mean, and again, I mean, this is a little bit better than anecdotal, right? Because we've taken 3 different variants in and looked at what is the floor on these, and we're seeing they're pretty close to the same. The science-oriented builds, so not the Juggy, have a higher ceiling at 130 power levels on your auxiliary side. But I would say the Juggy probably averaged slightly higher. Now, all of them were over 100, well over 100 on the average. So, from what I'm seeing here, there is not any kind of a real trade-off in terms of the fact that there's not any kind of auxiliary power, reduction or reduction on the draw on it, like you would have with any of your power to weapons. So let's just kind of take a look at this for a moment. So if we were to look at one of the main must-have abilities that we talk about quite a bit, it's going to be Emergency Weapons Cycle, right? And the reason for that is because it has a 50% weapons power cost reduction for 30 seconds anytime you use emergency power to weapons. So this synergizes excellent. It's very, very nice. So if your weapons were drawing 12, each one, they're only going to draw 6. So it's a huge reduction that you would get from using this. And so, and there's other items in the game, other traits, other consoles and things like that also further reduce this. And I think right off the top, knowing that and looking at the fact that auxiliary doesn't have that, it's easy to make the argument that, okay, well, it doesn't make sense and that's not going to work. But in the testing that we just looked at here, that really was not a big deal. That being the case. So I think that these weapons are definitely viable. I think that we can put together some pretty creative stuff with them. I just started kind of playing with them, so I'm really interested to see what I can do with it, and what you guys can do with it. And I hope you share if you do have these. But I think this brings kind of a little bit of a unique kind of difference to how we normally look at building stuff. I'm not using emergency power to weapons and things like that like I normally would do on something where I'm using energy weapons. I'm using emergency power to auxiliary. Now, most of your other weapons boosts are still going to work, so your batteries are still going to work because it's just for energy weapons damage. It's not for the power setting on it. Same thing with, if you're using Good Day to Die, mixing that in and different things like that. So any of your damage output boosts and things like that obviously are going to do the same exact thing, but anything that we would normally use to boost our weapons power or reduce the draw from the weapons power are going to be completely ineffective, and you're going to need to look at those weapons as basically being science weapons, quote unquote, where they are purely based around your auxiliary settings. So if you can make that shift and look at how to integrate those, I think that you could do pretty darn well. I've ran this build, 2 variants on this particular ship, and I'll just show you the build here. This isn't done, but I have 2 different layouts for this particular ship. This is more of kind of a hybrid. The other one was a little bit more towards science, and I didn't use any promo stuff, which I used on this one. And so this one's a little bit more expensive, but the other one that I put together, it did just as well. Both of those builds, I've ran them 3 times each, have averaged about 220 K in an ISA, and those were pugs. Not team, not supported or anything like that. Same thing with the Titan that we looked at. I only ran that through once with those particular weapons, and it did well over 200K. Now, that's not just because of those weapons. That build normally does that. So I guess kind of to sum up, these weapons aren't, as of right now that I can see, and I'm nowhere near, the top theory crafter in the game or any of those kinds of things. I don't see them becoming some special new meta or anything like that. But I think that they are a choice that you have, and I don't see any downside in using them if you build around them correctly. And if you're building them into a science ship, which is basically the only thing that they can go on, it really kind of takes care of itself. You basically can just forget about the weapons power and having to do anything to boost that if you are wanting to, prioritize those weapons up front a little bit. But if you're not and they're just a secondary, then it's good to go. Now, compared to running torpedoes up front, torpedoes are still going to be far superior to these cannons, but in order for those torpedoes to be far superior, you need some fairly expensive traits. So you need some of the meta torpedo traits in order to make those effective. So if you're on a budget and you have, even the tier 5 of one of these ships, you can just reclaim it multiple times, grab these weapons off if you're wanting to build around science. And personally, I like having this scatter volley build with the science, because a lot of times what I feel like is, even though you have that area of effect and you have that control, when that stuff's on cooldown, most of the time you become a single target, build, and that for me is kind of a bummer. So being able to have a little bit more of, you already have the crowd control, but then to be able to attack multiple targets at once with a cannon scatter volley effect, for me feels a lot better. I like it, and it gives you a better, damage output, being able to hit more stuff. Because even with a torpedo build, especially if it's a budget one and you're not able to, get those firing modes up quickly for torpedoes, it becomes a single target, torpedo firing, and it doesn't feel great when that's happening. So especially down on the budget side, you don't need this legendary version. You can have any of the Vestas and just pull these weapons off of it. And I just reclaimed the ship multiple times and then upgraded them and put them on. So I know this has been kind of a rant. I'm kind of thinking it out loud at the same time, but I watched a few other videos, and it's kind of going back and forth on whether or not these make sense because of where they draw the power from, and the fact that you can't reduce that draw on your auxiliary. But I think that we've shown just from this basic test of these 3 different builds that we're not seeing a huge difference there. The other side of it is that these are going to go on science builds, right? So there's only 3 of them up front. It's not like, on the Juggy where you got 5 cannons up front and dual heavy, the fire cycle haste and all of those kinds of things, where that reduction or ability to reduce the draw on that is even more important. So I guess part of it is that it's not as important to have that drain reduction on that subsystem with a build like this, because you only have 3 of them up front. So you have 2 less than what you would have on most of your CSV builds. So to sum up, what I think is that if you are going to go your energy weapons as being the primary and your science abilities being more of your secondary on a particular build, then it probably makes sense to go with some sort of standard weapons that are going to draw from the weapon's power. And the reason for that is because there's so many more to pick from, right? So you have the Terran Task Force weapons, you have the wide-angle dual beam banks. There's just quite a bit more to pick from, where the weapon itself is just better. And so you would get a lot more damage by going with one of those weapons, as opposed to just basically standard phasers that are, drawing from Aux or from wherever. If you are going to go with your EPG or control as being your primary, then I think you're probably better off going with the auxiliary phasers, because you don't have to give anything up in order to get a good amount of damage out of them. It just depends on how you're going to build around this. So basically, again, just to kind of recap, if science is number 1, then I think the auxiliary phasers are going to be the way to go. If your main objective is, getting as much as you can out of your your energy weapons, but you still want to have, you know, the science stuff happening to add into that as your secondary, then using things like the Terran Task Force weapons, or again, the dual wide beam banks from the Discovery rep. You know, I think that probably makes sense to go that direction. In terms of the power draw potential issues, I'm not seeing any kind of issue there. If you're going to go, you know, more towards that science heavy and run those, I was not seeing any kind of major reduction that would give me pause and make me say, you know, these are not worth using in any instance. I'll just, even if I was going to go full science and use regular weapons, I'll just turn my regular weapons down some. I don't think that's the case, with the exception of the fact that there are a huge amount of very, very good standardized weapons, standardized being ones that draw from your weapon's power, like the ones I've already mentioned. So that's just going to kind of have to be something that you, you know, kind of determine, you know, what do you have, what makes sense for you, what's fun for you. I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's what really matters. I'm having a lot of fun with this. Could I build things that are probably even more effective? Sure. But I'm liking this because it's different and, you know, kind of shakes things up and makes the game even funner for me. So I hope that was helpful, guys. I hope that shed a little bit more light on, you know, where these might fit into a build for you. Again, it's going to be different for everybody depending on how you build, what you have, and what's fun for you. So again, I hope that was helpful. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And until next time, have a good one. Appreciate you watching. Hey guys, appreciate you watching. Be sure to hit the thumbs up button, ring the bell, and sub to the channel for the latest news updates and how-to guides.